Imagine you are standing in total darkness. Above you is 3 miles of freezing ocean water. The pressure is so intense it could crush a tank like a tin can. And right in front of you sits a graveyard of nuclear missiles. In 1974, the CIA didn't just look at this nightmare, they decided to conquer it. They spent $4 billion on a heist that sounds like science fiction. This is the story of a stolen submarine, a billionaire's lie, and the most daring secret mission in history. Welcome to Trench Waters, where we dive deep into the world's most classified mysteries and bring the truth to the surface. Our story starts with a ghost. March 1968. The Soviet submarine K-129 was patrolling the North Pacific, carrying enough nuclear power to wipe out the entire west coast of America. Then, in a heartbeat, it vanished. The Soviet Navy was terrified. They sent everything they had, ships, planes, and submarines, to find it. For 30 days, they searched every inch of the surface, but they found nothing. The K-129 was gone, swallowed by the abyss. Eventually, the Kremlin gave up, leaving their sailors and their secrets in a watery grave. But while the Soviets were blind, the United States was listening. Deep on the ocean floor, a secret American network of microphones called SOSUS heard the end. They heard the explosion. They heard the hull collapse. And using complex mathematics, they did what the Soviets couldn't. They found the needle in the haystack. The wreck was sitting 16,500 feet down. That is higher than the tallest peaks of the Rockies, but inverted into the deep. When the CIA saw the secret photos of the wreck, they realized this wasn't just a tragedy, it was a gold mine. Inside that broken hull were the Soviet Union's most guarded secrets, their warhead designs, their propulsion systems, and the ultimate prize, their cryptographic codebooks. If the CIA could steal that submarine, they would own the Cold War. But how do you lift 2,000 tons of radioactive steel from 3 miles down without the Russians ever knowing? The answer was a plan so bold, it would either be the greatest intelligence win in history or the start of World War III. The discovery of the K-129 put the CIA in a position they had never occupied before. They weren't just looking at a sunken ship, they were looking at the ultimate intelligence jackpot. But as the engineers at Langley began to crunch the numbers, the sheer audacity of what they were proposing began to sink in. To understand the scale of this gamble, you have to understand the environment of the North Pacific. At 16,000 feet, the ocean is not just water, it is a crushing alien world. The pressure at that depth is roughly 7,000 pounds per square inch. To put that in simple terms, it is the equivalent of having a solid block of lead the size of a car resting on every square inch of your body. No salvage operation in human history had ever attempted to lift more than a few hundred pounds from such a depth. The CIA wanted to lift 2,000 tons. The initial meetings inside the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology were tense. Some experts called it a fool's errand. They argued that even if you could build a claw strong enough to grab the submarine, the mechanical stress of pulling it through 3 miles of water would cause the hull to disintegrate. It was like trying to lift a wet cigar with a pair of tweezers. But the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, knew that the potential reward outweighed the astronomical risk. This wasn't just about engineering, it was about the survival of the United States. If the Soviets launched a nuclear strike, the US needed to know exactly how their missiles functioned, and more importantly, how to jam their communication frequencies. The mission was given a secret code name, Project Azorian. But a project this big couldn't be hidden in a basement. They needed a massive ship, specialized equipment, and a crew of hundreds. If a government-owned vessel showed up in the middle of the Pacific and started hovering over a Soviet wreck, it would be seen as an act of war. The CIA needed a lie so big and so expensive that no one would dare question it. They needed a civilian front. And there was only one man on Earth eccentric enough to play the part: Howard Hughes. At the time, Hughes was the richest and most mysterious man in the world. He was a reclusive billionaire who owned airlines, tool companies, and massive industrial empires. He was also known for his unpredictable behavior. If Howard Hughes announced he was building a giant ship to mine the ocean floor for minerals, the public wouldn't think CIA. They would just think, there goes Hughes again, spending his billions on another crazy dream. The CIA approached Hughes's inner circle with a deal. Hughes would provide the name, the prestige, and the corporate cover. In exchange, the government would fund the construction of a ship that would defy the laws of physics. This ship would be the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The cover story was brilliant. It was called Deep Sea Mining. The world was told that the Glomar Explorer was designed to harvest manganese nodules. These are small, potato-sized rocks that sit on the ocean floor, rich in nickel, copper, and cobalt. Because the world's land-based minerals were being depleted, the idea of mining the sea was actually a popular scientific theory at the time. The CIA went so far as to hire actual mining experts and oceanographers. They published fake scientific papers. They gave interviews to major newspapers about the future of underwater resource gathering. The lie was so perfectly crafted that even the engineers building the ship, men who weren't cleared for the top-secret mission, truly believed they were building the future of the mining industry. But underneath the drilling equipment and deep within the hull of the Glomar Explorer was a secret hangar the size of a football field. It was a hidden chamber designed for one purpose only: to hide a stolen Soviet ghost. The stage was set, the money was flowing, and the world's greatest deception was officially underway. By 1971, the blueprints for the most complex ship in human history were complete. But building the Hughes Glomar Explorer was a task that felt more like a space mission than a naval construction project. The CIA couldn't just build it in a government shipyard. To maintain the cover story, they had to build it in the open, right in front of the world. The contract was awarded to Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Pennsylvania. To the thousands of workers at the shipyard, this was just another massive commercial contract for the eccentric Howard Hughes. But as the steel began to take shape, it became clear that this was no ordinary vessel. The Glomar Explorer was over 600 feet long and weighed 50,000 tons. But the real secret was what lay hidden beneath the waterline. The heart of the ship was a massive internal docking bay known as the moon pool. This moon pool was essentially a giant hole in the bottom of the ship, measuring nearly 200 feet long. It was equipped with massive gates that could open and close, allowing the ship to swallow objects from the ocean floor without anyone on the surface seeing a thing. It was a floating hangar, a secret base hidden within the hull of a civilian mining ship. However, there was a massive engineering problem. The claw, the heavy mechanical device meant to grab the submarine, was far too large to be built on the Glomar itself without drawing suspicion from Soviet satellites. The CIA needed a way to transport the claw to the ship in total secrecy. Their solution was a second, even more mysterious vessel called the HMB-1, short for Hughes Mining Barge No. 1. The HMB-1 was a giant covered barge that looked like a floating warehouse. It was built in San Diego under a massive roof to hide it from overhead cameras. Once the claw was finished and loaded into the barge, the HMB-1 was towed out to a remote spot in the ocean and submerged until it was completely underwater. Then, in a maneuver that had never been tried before, the Glomar explorer sailed directly over the submerged barge. The ship opened its moon pool gates and, using massive winches, lifted the claw out of the barge and into its own belly. In one clean motion, the heist's most important tool was hidden from the world. While the physical ship was being built, a second war was being fought, the War of Information. The CIA knew that Soviet intelligence was obsessed with Howard Hughes. To keep the Russians from looking too closely at the ship's internal mechanics, the CIA's office operation planted fake leaks. They let it be known that Hughes was obsessed with finding a specific type of rare mineral that only existed in the North Pacific. They even hired a nearly 200 men, mostly civilians, who were told they were pioneers of a new industry. These men underwent months of training in deep-sea drilling and heavy lifting. Most of them had no idea they were actually being trained to handle a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine. They were part of a lie so deep that even the people living it didn't know the truth. But as the ship finally neared completion in 1973, the pressure began to mount. The budget was skyrocketing, and the Soviet Union was becoming increasingly suspicious of American activity in the Pacific. The Glomar Explorer was no longer just a ship. It was a $4 billion ticking bomb, and the man who owned it, Howard Hughes, was slipping further into madness, making the CIA's job of controlling the narrative harder every single day. If the Glomar Explorer was the body of the mission, then the device it carried in its belly was the soul. Officially, the CIA called it the capture vehicle, but to the engineers who spent years designing it, it was simply known as Clementine. Clementine was a mechanical monster. It was a massive steel structure, nearly 200 feet long, equipped with 8 powerful hydraulic arms. These arms were designed to reach out and wrap around the hull of the K-129 like the fingers of a giant hand. But designing a claw to work 3 miles underwater was a task that pushed 1970s technology to its absolute limit. At 16,000 feet, traditional lubricants would freeze or seize up. Standard electrical systems would short-circuit instantly. Every single component of Clementine had to be custom-built to survive a world that was actively trying to destroy it. The engineers had to solve the silt problem. The K-129 wasn't just sitting on the ocean floor. It was partially buried in decades of fine, powdery volcanic silt. If the claw simply grabbed the submarine, the suction of the mud would hold it down like superglue. To solve this, Clementine was equipped with high-pressure water jets designed to blast the silt away from the hull before the lift began. To see what they were doing, the engineers mounted dozens of underwater cameras and powerful strobe lights onto the claw. But in 1974, there were no fiber optic cables to transmit high-definition video. The signal had to travel up 3 miles of copper wire. By the time the image reached the control room on the Glomar, it was a flickering, snowy, black and white ghost of an image. Then there was the matter of the pipe string. To lower Clementine to the bottom, the Glomar used a system of heavy-duty steel pipes, similar to what you would see on an oil rig, but on a much more massive scale. The ship would connect one 30-foot section of pipe, lower it, and then screw on the next one, over and over and over again. By the time the claw reached the submarine, the ship would be suspended by a 3-mile-long umbilical cord of steel. This pipe string weighed over 8 million pounds. If the Glomar Explorer drifted just a few yards in the ocean currents, the lateral force would snap that pipe string like a dry twig. To prevent this, the ship used a revolutionary technology called dynamic positioning. A series of computer-controlled thrusters were placed around the hull. These thrusters worked in perfect harmony with satellite signals and seafloor transponders to keep the ship locked in one exact spot, even in heavy swells. It was the ancestor of the GPS technology we use today. But even with the best computers, the risk was terrifying. If the claw grabbed the submarine and a single hydraulic seal failed, or if a single pipe in the 3-mile string had a microscopic crack, the entire 2,000-ton prize would go screaming back to the bottom, potentially taking the Glomar Explorer down with it. The men in the control room knew they were walking a tightrope over an abyss. They were about to attempt a lift that defied every known rule of salvage. Clementine was ready, the pipes were prepped, and 3 miles below, the K-129 was waiting in the dark. By the summer of 1974, the secret was no longer just on paper. It was a 50,000-ton reality, steaming across the Pacific Ocean. The Hughes Glomar Explorer had begun its long journey to the target site. But for the CIA, the voyage was a walk on a razor's edge. Because the ship was too massive to fit through the Panama Canal, it had to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America, through the treacherous waters of Cape Horn. For weeks, the crew battled some of the most violent storms on the planet. Every time a massive wave slammed into the hull, the engineers held their breath, praying that the secret moon pool gates and the delicate lifting equipment inside wouldn't be damaged before the mission even began. While the ship moved, the CIA's disinformation campaign was working overtime. They continued to feed stories to the press about Howard Hughes' obsession with deep-sea mining, but the Soviet Union wasn't entirely convinced. They knew that the Americans were up to something in the North Pacific, and they sent their own shadows to investigate. As the Glomar Explorer reached the exact coordinates of the K-129, 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, they weren't alone. On the horizon, a Soviet naval tugboat, the Chazma, appeared. It was an AGI, an Auxiliary General Intelligence Vessel, packed with electronic eavesdropping equipment. The Soviets began to circle. They flew helicopters directly over the Glomar's deck, trying to peer inside. They monitored every radio frequency, looking for a slip-up. Inside the Glomar Explorer, the tension was suffocating. The Americans had to maintain the Mining Act perfectly. They went as far as to have the crew stand on the deck in civilian clothes, holding pieces of rock and pretending to study them with excitement. They even dumped fake waste material over the side to simulate the byproduct of a mining operation. But the biggest threat wasn't on the horizon, it was in a safe in Los Angeles. Just as the ship was preparing to lower the claw, a group of burglars broke into Howard Hughes' headquarters on Romaine Street. They stole a series of documents, including a secret memo that linked the Glomar Explorer to the CIA. For the directors at Langley, this was the ultimate nightmare. If those documents reached the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times, the Soviet Navy would descend on the Glomar within hours. The CIA worked frantically with the FBI to suppress the story, begging editors to hold the news in the name of national security. The clock was ticking. The Soviets were watching. The press was digging. And beneath the ship, the K-129 was still waiting. On July 4th, 1974, while America was celebrating its independence, the order was finally given. Deploy the vehicle. The massive gates of the moon pool groaned open, and Clementine began its 3-mile descent into the abyss. There was no turning back now. They were either going to pull off the greatest heist in history or trigger a global catastrophe. July 1974. The Hughes Glomar Explorer is finally positioned directly over the graveyard of the K-129. 3 miles below, the Soviet submarine is waiting in the crushing dark. This was the moment of truth. The order was given, and the descent began. Piece by piece, the 3-mile-long pipe string was lowered into the abyss. It took days of agonizingly slow work. On the monitors, the crew watched as Clementine, the giant claw, slowly approached the ocean floor. Suddenly, the cameras picked up a shape. There it was, the twisted, rusted hull of the K-129. The atmosphere in the control room was electric. No one spoke. The operators, using joysticks that felt far too small for a machine this size, maneuvered the claw into position. With a massive hydraulic groan, the arms of Clementine reached out and embraced the Soviet submarine. We have a capture. The lift began. Inch by inch, the winches on the Glomar started pulling millions of pounds of steel toward the surface. For hours, everything went perfectly. The submarine was rising. 1 mile, then 2 miles. They were almost home. But then, the sensors detected a massive vibration. A sound like a thunderclap echoed through the hull of the ship. Deep underwater, disaster had struck. The intense pressure and the weight of the submarine had been too much for the steel. 3 of the claw's massive arms had snapped. In an instant, the K-129 began to break apart. All that remained in the claw's grip was the bow section, only 38 feet of a submarine that was once over 300 feet long. The mission wasn't a total failure, but the Holy Grail, the codes, and the missiles were gone forever. The CIA was left with a choice. Do they drop what's left and try again? Or do they bring up the fragments and hope there's still something worth $4 billion inside? They decided to pull. As the remains of the K-129 were finally pulled into the moon pool of Glomar Explorer, the air was filled with the smell of oil, salt, and death. They had caught a ghost, but it was a broken one. Inside the massive, humid moon pool of the Glomar Explorer, the silence was heavy. The recovery team stood on the catwalks, staring down at the mangled 38-foot section of the K-129. It was a haunting sight. The steel was twisted, blackened by fire, and covered in deep-sea silt. As the engineers began to drain the water and decontaminate the area, the smell reached them. It was the overwhelming scent of diesel fuel, rotted rubber, and something far more somber. It was the smell of a tomb. The CIA's primary targets, the nuclear missiles and the code room, were lost to the abyss when the claw snapped. But the bow section was not empty. Inside, the recovery team found 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes. While not the strategic missiles they had hoped for, these torpedoes were still a massive intelligence win. They provided the U.S. Navy with a direct look at Soviet underwater propulsion and warhead triggering systems. But the most delicate discovery was the most human one. Within the wreckage, the team found the remains of 6 Soviet sailors. These men had been at their stations when the K-129 imploded 6 years earlier. They were young, far from home, and caught in a war of shadows they didn't live to see. The CIA was faced with a difficult decision. They were in the middle of a high-stakes espionage mission, but they were also looking at the bodies of fellow mariners. Despite the Cold War, there is an ancient law of the sea, a respect for the dead that transcends politics. Under the direct orders of the CIA, the crew prepared a formal burial at sea. They treated the remains with the highest level of dignity. The sailors were placed in metal coffins, draped in the flag of the Soviet Union, the very country the CIA was working so hard to undermine. On September 4, 1974, a secret ceremony was held on the deck of the Glomar explorer. A crew member who spoke fluent Russian recited the traditional Soviet burial service. A chaplain performed the rites, and as the ship's band played the Soviet national anthem, the coffins were slowly slid into the deep blue waters of the Pacific. The entire ceremony was filmed by the CIA, but the footage was locked in a vault for decades. It was a moment of profound humanity in the middle of a $4 billion heist. The Americans had spent years trying to steal the Soviet Union's most dangerous weapons, yet they stopped everything to honor the Soviet Union's fallen sons. But back in Langley, the mood was less sentimental. The mission had only recovered a fraction of what was promised. The code books were still at the bottom of the ocean. The missiles were gone. The CIA began to realize that their successful failure was about to become public knowledge. The shadows were fading, and the world was about to start asking questions. By early 1975, the Hughes Glomar Explorer had returned to port. The bow of the K-129 had been studied, its secrets harvested, and the project was officially winding down. The CIA believed they had gotten away with it. They had spent nearly a decade and $4 billion, and the world was still convinced Howard Hughes was just looking for rocks. But a secret this big, involving thousands of people, eventually finds a crack in the wall. The crack began with a man named Jack Anderson, an investigative journalist known for digging into the darkest corners of Washington. He had been hearing whispers about a Project Jennifer, a secret mission to raise a Soviet sub. At the same time, the Los Angeles Times was following the story of the burglary at Howard Hughes's headquarters. The dots were finally being connected. In March 1975, the story broke. The headline sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and the White House. The world now knew that the mining ship was a CIA heist vessel. The Soviet Union was humiliated, and the American public was stunned by the sheer cost and audacity of the mission. Journalists rushed to the CIA, demanding answers. They wanted to know if the mission was a success. They wanted to know about the nuclear missiles. They wanted to know about the budget. The CIA was in a corner. If they admitted the mission was a success, it could be seen as an act of war by the Soviets. If they admitted it was a failure, they would look incompetent and wasteful. Their solution changed the legal landscape of America forever. A CIA lawyer named Walt Logan came up with a phrase that was both brilliant and frustrating. When asked about Project Azorian, the agency replied, "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the information requested." This became known as the Glomar response. It allowed the government to acknowledge that a request was made without actually admitting that the project even existed. To this day, it remains the ultimate shield for classified operations around the globe. Project Azorian was never repeated. A second mission, Project Matador, was planned to go back and get the rest of the K-129, but the media leak made it impossible. The Glomar Explorer was eventually mothballed and later sold to a private drilling company. In 2015, the ship that once carried the weight of the Cold War was sold for scrap. So, was it worth it? The CIA officially calls Project Azorian one of the greatest intelligence successes of the century. Even though they didn't get the code books, they learned more about Soviet submarine construction, nuclear materials, and underwater acoustics than they could have in 50 years of traditional spying. But more than that, Project Azorian proved that with enough money, enough secrecy, and enough engineering genius, the impossible is only a matter of perspective. The K-129 still rests at the bottom of the Pacific, what's left of it, a silent monument to a war fought in the shadows. And in the halls of the CIA, the Glomar remains a legend, the $4 billion ghost that almost changed everything. Thank you for diving into the depths with Trench Waters. If you enjoyed this journey into the abyss, hit the subscribe button and join us as we uncover more of the world's most classified mysteries. Until next time, stay curious.